then you burst into fire. Forever.
Hello. Hello. You're listening to The Full Blossom of the Evening, a podcast about David Lynch and Twin Peaks.
I'm Indigo.
And I'm Hilary.
And listeners, we're going to tell it to you, and we're going to tell it to you straight. Today, we are talking about
Marlon Brando and the Wild One.
And I saw her glowing. I saw her smiling. I feel like I'm gonna dream tonight.
So, I think when we first started planning this episode, when it made its way onto our roster, I don't think either of us knew what we were in for.
No, I mean, first of all, I hadn't seen the film, didn't know anything about it. We talked a little bit about that before we really started researching this topic and really interacting with the media. We had a very different view of the character of Wally Brando, and this kind of opened our eyes.
Oh, yes. I think we both thought this would be a nice, lighthearted episode about a funny character and an old movie. And as what happens so many times, I think, for both of us when we're exploring one of these little side streets of Twin Peaks and David Lynch, is what we expect to be simple and straightforward ends up being complex and beautiful, and the payoff is so huge.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, honestly, again, this was meant to be sort of one of our more lighthearted episodes, and it will be. There is like a lot of, joy and laughter that comes with some of the stuff we're going to be talking about. But there were also just like some really heartfelt moments. There was a lot of unexpected crying, but like happy crying and like moved to emotions crying. And if there's one thing that we've learned from this, is that Marlon Brando says it is okay to cry.
I love that. Marlon Brando says it's okay to cry.
Encourages us.
Both of us came to this beginning research for this episode with very little knowledge of the Wild One and Marlon Brando.
Yeah, just, I mean, in general, when we sort of talked about it, neither of us had really, seen a lot of media when he was like younger and weren't really familiar with him in that way. I don't even know that I had seen any images of him, in the Wild One getup, and his biker getup. I feel like if I saw any pictures of him young, they were kind of just like him in like normal clothes, just like a t-shirt and like slacks or something, and that was about it. Otherwise, like everything was just him. I was like, oh, that old guy. And then we also sell this book Marlon Brando at my bookstore that I work at, and that was about it. I was like, oh, the bunny guy.
Did you know that Wally Brando was imitating Marlon Brando when you saw Twin Peaks?
I didn't, because
Okay.
again, I had no point of reference for that. And so when I first saw that character, it was easy to just sort of be like, okay, I know that with Lynch, everything is very intentional, but at the same time, this does feel like a little bit silly, and I don't know what it was like, I know this is intentional, I just don't know what it is that he's trying to do with it. And then you were the one that you had brought up, you were like, well, do you know that he's imitating him in the Wild One? And I was like, I had no idea. Okay, now we have to look into this.
Yeah.
And it's spot on.
Right. And I only knew the image of Johnny Strabler. That so when I saw Wally Brando appear, I was like, oh, okay, he's like that. I don't even know for sure if I knew it was Marlon Brando. I think context clues, like, oh, his name is Wally Brando. He was born on Marlon Brando's birthday.
Right.
I thought, oh, okay, that must be the actor who plays that motorcycle guy who's in the Andy Warhol print. Like, literally, that's my frame of reference for this character.
Well, that's very Pittsburgh for us, too.
So I'd only seen it in the Andy Warhol print, and It's just one of those kind of flat, static, iconic images that a lot of us in the 20th century would have been aware of.
Yeah.
It just, listeners, you can probably picture this too. Just Marlon Brando slouched over the front of his motorcycle with his hat slightly askew on his head, and that's what Wally Brando is imitating.
Right. I mean, even down to the leather jacket, both having the embroidery of the name. Like when you actually compare the two photos side by side, if you compare photos of either of those characters side by side, the costuming, they did a
100%.
phenomenal job.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It is. Every detail is there. You know, the thing about seeing the film, for me, because I was familiar with the static image, it was startling to watch that static image come to life in this character.
And was it what you had pictured?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Because I was so charmed by Marlon Brando in this film.
I do remember you saying that when we first had our meeting, that you were like, I was thinking of old Marlon Brando. I didn't think I could be charmed.
Fat Marlon Brando.
And then you were saying that it was the bar scene when he comes in. You were like, okay, wait a minute now. He's kind of giving her the smolder and like kind of smirking, and you were like, wait, I think I get it.
I think I get it. And the funny thing is for me is I am someone who never gets it when it comes to actors. When like people are like, oh, I don't know, who is an actor who's considered attractive now? They all
nowadays it's like, I don't know, Jacob Elordi, but also he's like what, 12?
But literally they all blend together in my mind.
Right.
Even like classic Hollywood actors, whatever, they all look the same to me. And so if young Marlon Brando could break through that wall, what wall couldn't he break through?
It's all the charisma. It really
so
is.
Much. Yeah.
Like you see him walking around and you're like, oh, he's a good looking guy. But that bar scene, he like really puts on the charm with her and it got you.
It did. Part of it is their dynamic too.
Yeah.
He and Mary Murphy have this wonderful, weird chemistry.
It is kind of weird because it's like she's not set on him yet. She like can't really make up her mind about him at first and for quite a while. And he's pretty set on her, but then starts to waver. And so it's like, what is this dynamic here? Do you guys like each other or not? But there is this definite attraction and like tension, like sexual tension. And it's just really interesting to see it play out and unfold, especially in comparison to the characters that they are essentially representing from the original short story.
Oh, yeah.
Which there's a very different dynamic in the short story.
Yes, and we are going to talk about that short story for sure. But I know that they were both... Marlon Brando doesn't like to say that he was a method actor, but a lot of what we would colloquially call method acting is what they did. And so they stayed in character all the time. Mary Murphy and Marlon Brando would go to the canteen during breaks and they would stay in character. And like have lunch as those characters, which I think it really pays off in the film.
I mean, it definitely does. I mean, and we see that with modern actors too, where it's like you can totally tell watching something if these actors have any kind of connection. Sometimes you're watching something and like the lines are there, everything else is there, the setting's there, they're both good looking people, but there's just no connection. They're like, it's so dry between them, it just feels forced, and it does not feel that way with them.
No, not a bit. But I guess for me, the really startling thing was seeing this flat, static image come to life. That it's like, you know, the reason this image became so popular and iconic, this character, is because of Marlon Brando's charisma and charm and acting. But after the film loses popularity, what later generations are left with is just the flat, static image.
Right.
And I think of it like with Marilyn Monroe, too. That so many of us have seen a billion images of Marilyn.
Right.
But to see her in action.
I know. And also, that's another like great example too of where like that doesn't even scratch the surface of who she was as an actual human too. You know, like when we see her as this static image, it's not even always as a particular character, but we see Marilyn Monroe as a character. But it's like, no, she was actually a human being. She was very smart, which people never seem to know. Very, very talented. And yeah, it's that same way with Brando. And I remember that you had mentioned that it had such an impact that, wasn't it that they banned those jackets, the leather jackets in schools? Because all the kids were like, I gotta look just like him. I gotta get me one of those jackets. And the schools were like, somebody stop them.
just don't let them buy the jacket.
No jackets here.
That information actually is right on the jacket manufacturer's website.
Oh my
The
gosh.
jacket is still made and available today. It's a Schott 618 Perfecta. So
How many smackaroons do you think one of them goes for?
not that I've shopped around, but around $900.
Oh my God. Okay. So when we make it big, when this podcast makes it big and we,
Ladies and gentlemen,
become millionaires.
if we ever start monetizing this, which we never would,
Yeah.
it would be to buy jackets.
You can rest assured that any money we ever make off of this would just strictly go to taking a trip to Twin Peaks and eating a lot of pie, and then also maybe jackets. Maybe cool matching jackets.
Could we get them embroidered?
Oh, we're getting them embroidered. Oh, we're totally getting them embroidered.
Amazing.
Do you want to be Johnny or Wally?
All right. So one thing we have to give credit to here is very late in our research, and I mean like with maybe a week to go, I found a book that I ended up getting and then speed reading and just being so glad. So most of the research that we reference in this episode will come from this book by Bert Kearns called Marlon Brando, Hollywood Rebel. It was just published in April of 2024, so this year as we're recording. And so many of the stories, the anecdotes, historical details that I had found from other sources prior to finding this book are not only repeated here, but told in even better detail.
Yeah.
So listeners, we can't recommend this enough.
Yeah. And also, I mean, really, we were so lucky with the timing that it was like this book knew that it needed to come out into the universe so that we could use it on the podcast.
Yeah, because it's not just another Marlon Brando biography.
Right.
It's specifically about the impact of Marlon Brando on American culture, and very specifically this film's impact on American culture. So it was really tailor-made for our purposes. We can't do it justice here in this podcast, but we can definitely recommend it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So if we don't cite our source, just understand that it's coming from Kearns's book.
Yes. Any little anecdotes or historical stuff, it's probably from that.
Yeah. Unless we cite otherwise.
Yes.
Yeah. So we're going to start with a little bit about the history of the film. So, it's based on a story. And that story was based on what was called the Hollister Riot, which took place 4th of July weekend in 1947 in Hollister, California.
Yeah, and the Hollister Riot was kind of an overblown depiction by a San Francisco journalist that included staged photos of drunkenness and destruction. Local articles depicted the events in more measured terms, and the only injuries were to the bikers themselves. Proof that it wasn't a devastating event, the town of Hollister hosted another motorcycle event just 3 months later. They hosted a 50-year anniversary of the supposed riot in 1997. So, like, they made it out to be this big deal. And honestly, they were like, no, it was, like, pretty chill, you know?
Yeah.
Like, and I assume, like, a lot of the injuries they had to themselves, it was just, like, you fall off your bike, you scrape yourself or something.
Yeah, and there was some drunken rowdiness and that sort of thing,
Right.
but it wasn't anything like showed up in the San Francisco newspaper or in Life magazine.
No.
So motorcycle clubs first started becoming popular in America in the 1920s, but they grew and changed dramatically after World War II. A lot of veterans had ridden motorcycles in the Second World War, Harleys, in fact. And they came home really longing from that camaraderie they experienced while serving in the military. So towns like Hollister hosted rallies, races, etc. for motorcycle clubs, and these followed rules. And those were the rules set up by the American Motorcyclist Association, or the AMA. And so at the very beginning of the Wild One, we see an event just like this, like an AMA sanctioned style event. It's the race that our Black rebels crash and disrupt. One of the squares, I have that in quotation marks here. One of the squares.
The losers.
There at that race in the film, they call the Black rebels an outlaw outfit.
Yeah, I mean, they are the rebels. And the first outlaw motorcycle clubs were just those that rebelled against the AMA rules. So, like, don't picture the kind of outlaw biker gangs that, like, by the mid to late 20th century were involved in all sorts of serious criminal activity. You know, I think when we think of now motorcycle gangs, you know, we're thinking of, like, what is it, Hell's Angels and stuff like that. You know, I'm sure you can picture it. You picture, like, a seedy dive bar. They roll up. It's pretty scary, you know. But these were just basically drunken mischief makers. These were like rowdy young men.
Yes. And they were still weekend warriors with jobs.
Yeah.
You know, the outlaw clubs caused some drama in Hollister, but the whole event cleared out in time for everyone to go back to work.
Yeah.
You know, and you also see that in the Wild One with the Black Rebels, because Johnny tells Kathy, on the weekends we go out and have a ball. The bunch gets together after all week. It builds up. Like even this character is still a weekend warrior.
Right. Like, this is just their way of kind of letting off some steam. And maybe they're a little rowdy about it, but
yeah. Well, one of the first outlaw clubs was called the Booze Fighters, headed by Wino Willie. And
it's just such a name. Like, what a specific name to choose for yourself.
They claim to be a, quote, drinking club with a motorcycle problem.
I love that so much. That's like, that reminds me of like the classic, I love the phrase when people say, I've had too many martinis. That's kind of what that's giving for me.
That's great.
So the Booze Fighters were present at Hollister, and some of them, including Wino Willie, were extras in the Wild One. While conducting research for the film, Marlon Brando and producer Stanley Kramer spent time with motorcycle clubs and gangs up and down California. The legend is that the most famous line in the film was a quote from one of these real outlaw bikers. Stanley Kramer asked, "Well, what is it you're rebelling against?" And a biker shouted, "Well, what you got?"
Hey, somebody tell me what that means. BRMC. What does it mean?
Black Rebels Motorcycle Club.
Isn't that cute? Hey, Johnny, what are you rebelling against?
What do you got?
Like these just kind of sound like they're a hoot.
Yeah, for sure. And I love that line, what do you got, right, comes from real bikers.
Right, it's spot on.
Well, these first outlaw clubs were really about fun on the surface, but there was a darkness beneath it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like many World War II veterans, including Wino Willie, experienced incredible trauma as a result of the war. They didn't talk about it, and there was little recognition of or treatment for it. I mean, the amount of PTSD, and it just wasn't talked about, and there was no support for that. And their experiences made them skeptical of or hostile towards mainstream values and rules. And they really struggled to fit back into normal society after everything that they had experienced. And so these first outlaw bicycle clubs were at least partly an expression of that. And we see that in the story and movie. There are mentions that some of these guys are veterans and that they have these experiences. And again, it's just, how do you come back from that when there's no support?
Right.
And which is why it's so important nowadays. Like, I feel like, we try really hard to provide support for veterans. But yeah, so thinking back to these times where there was almost nothing, you come back, you're looking to build that kind of brotherhood again, where you're like, I'm used to having this group of guys that has my back.
Yeah.
And we're there for each other, and we try to make the best of a tough situation. And what do? You see motorcycle clubs, and you're like, that could do it.
Let's go out and have a ball.
Right.
As Johnny says.
Yeah.
So Bert Kearns, in the book that we're referencing today, he writes, this is a quote from him, "These outlaws didn't just fall out of the sky. They were American-made products of a time of conformity and automation. They were rebelling against the status quo they'd fought a war to establish. They were rebels with a cause."
I love that.
You know, I saw a lot of similarities with the ethos of the Beat Generation and the abstract expressionists.
Yeah.
And ultimately, Johnny Strabler's like, "What do you got?" rebellion resonated so deeply with young people that it inspired much of the defining art and music of the 20th century. Period.
Yeah.
But we're going to talk a lot more about this later.
Yeah. I mean, you've got this, young, hot actor. He's so charismatic. He's playing a very cool role. And it's something that I'm sure a lot of like young people were seeing, and they felt this kindred connection with it.
No doubt.
Of just like, yeah, we got to do something. We got to shake this stuff up.
Yes, yes. All right, well, the reality of the events in Hollister mattered less than their portrayal in the San Francisco Chronicle and Life magazine, because the story that those publications told about terrifying lawlessness, violence, and mayhem became the defining narrative and ultimately inspired the Wild One.
Yeah. I mean, but first, of course, this goes back to Cyclist Raid by Frank Mooney, which was inspired by those exaggerated articles.
That's the story that the film was eventually based on.
Yes. And in that, and it is quite different from the movie, too. There's a lot of differences and changes. And in that, the cyclists are these like faceless conformists who remind the protagonist of fascists that he opposed in the war. When one of them kills his daughter, Kathy, no one can even distinguish the perpetrator. Nobody knows who it was because they've all got these like crazy goggles on, like that makes them like look pretty like bug-eyed. It's like they've all got identical clothing. The cyclists are just this anonymous menace that descends on this innocent, ordinary town, and they just carelessly destroy an innocent life, and also the town itself. You know, they just tear the place apart, and the whole time they're just this mass of like creepy, goggled-eyed guys.
Right, and they all kind of move in formation.
Yes, like a pack, like pack animals.
Right,
Yeah.
right, and it is different in that they kind of mimic the fascists, as you said.
Yeah.
Where in our film, of course, it's so different. They're
Right.
the nonconformists.
Yeah, they're
Yeah.
meant to be these insane villains in the story.
Yeah.
And almost like they have no humanity at all.
Right. Now, you read the story before you watched the film.
Yes. Yeah, because I am kind of a traditionalist in that way. If I know that there's a story or a book that something is based on, if I know in advance, I'll usually try to read it. Like if I see a new movie's coming out or something, I'm like, oh, I better speed read that.
What was your impression of the story when you first read it, beyond the little summary we just gave?
Yeah, so I think the thing that really jumped out to me at first was just this description of the small town. You know, it's a classic, like everybody knows everybody. It's very quaint. It's very kind of like old-fashioned, little bubble kind of. As they were describing like the townspeople and just the town itself, a lot of it really just reminded me of Twin Peaks. Like it could be totally set there. You know, this would be if like a crazed gang of motorcycle guys, you know, in these like matching uniforms and goggles showed up in Twin Peaks. You know, I could totally picture a lot of like the characters we love so much trying to stop these guys from taking over. And overall, like it was, yeah, it's just like this very sensationalized story of these biker gangs. It gets pretty brutal. Like them wearing the goggles, again, it really takes away their humanity. And in the movie, in comparison, you know, the actors don't wear these like weird goggles and matching uniforms. They have their own personalities. Each one of the little guys in the posse and Johnny's posse, they all have their own characteristics.
Yeah.
and different expressions, different personalities, and they're not just this faceless mass.
Yeah.
Which it's kind of interesting because it's like, is it better if harm is done by this faceless, like almost alien entity, or is it more damage if it's done by, like, you can tell that these are real human beings and they're doing this damage.
Right.
It's like, what is worse? What's the lesser of two evils in this situation? Harm's still being done. Do we prefer if it's easy to just be like those goggle-eyed monsters, or is it, this is like a pack of young men and we know their names and we know their faces?
Yeah. If you're going to be harmed, would you rather be harmed by... The answer is neither.
Yeah, it's not a good
But
position either way.
Yeah. So all of these differences between the story and the film were completely intentional.
Yeah.
So the film The Wild One was just loosely based on this short story, but Marlon Brando only agreed to do the film if, quote, the script made clear that the townsfolk, the straight, white-bread, so-called law-abiding members of the community, would be equally culpable for the violence, and that by the end of the picture, they and the audience would understand that the issues and stultifying social conditions that had caused the cyclist to rebel in the first place.
I mean, because the thing is, even in the story, at the end of the story, after Kathy is killed, one of the cyclists, the youngest one, who actually takes off his goggles while he's in town and tries to talk to the townspeople and like actually be a person, he comes back to apologize for Kathy's death.
Right.
And they beat him
Almost
like,
to death.
Yeah, like to a bloody pulp.
And by they, we mean the townspeople.
Yeah, it's, I mean, like, he comes back to apologize. He's like, he doesn't even, you know, he's not like, it was me, I did it. He's just like, I'm just so sorry that this happened. I can't believe they did this, and I need to get away from this gang now that's so violent, and I don't fit in with them. And they respond by taking out their anger and beating him to a pulp.
Right.
Which is also not the answer.
No.
Like that's
Yeah.
that's not how we respond. Like, I get that you've got this anger inside of you, but what does this solve?
Right.
It's not a life for a life. It's not an eye for an eye.
No, and so when Brando agrees to do this film, he's like, it's only on this condition, that it's not bikers versus townspeople, and the townspeople are good and the bikers are bad. It's like everyone is culpable.
Yeah.
Right.
And especially because he recognizes again that they are these like rebels with a cause, that the actual bikers, there's more to it than that.
Hollywood archivist David Del Valle said that Brando's, quote, concept of the Wild One was not just about being anti-establishment. It's about recognizing fascism in small towns and the attitude toward violence. Because one of the key points is that violence comes from the townspeople, not the bikers. In the film.
Yeah. In both, yeah. Yeah, it's, you know, we can see in this film the bikers are individuals, nonconformists. The men who oppose them are portrayed as flawed too.
Yeah, there's near the beginning, there's this man who's involved in a car accident with the bikers.
Yeah.
Right? It's what gets them to stay.
Yeah.
Because Crazy's leg gets broken.
Right.
And so they got to wait for Crazy.
Yeah. And it's so clear that also everyone in the town knows this guy and knows that he's like a jerk.
He's a bad driver.
Yeah.
And that's part of it. It's like, yeah, there's this accident, but he's a bad driver too.
Right.
You know, the sheriff of the town, who's also Kathy's father.
Yeah.
Like, he wants to treat the bikers fairly.
Yeah. It took two to tango.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And the bikers even try to help his car to get going again. But yeah, it starts things off on kind of a rough foot. And the townspeople kind of take that and run with it.
Yeah, the townspeople really pressure the sheriff to be disproportionately harsh with the bikers. Like, later, there's another situation where they pull this guy, Charlie, out of the car because he's like beeping at them and harassing the bikers. And the sheriff wants to take both Charlie and Chino, this other gang member who shows up, of course, to jail. And the townspeople are like, no, you can't take Charlie to jail. And we've got a quote from the film here.
Yeah. If you arrest Charlie Thomas, he'll never forgive you.
Yeah. He says Charlie could be part to blame, but these kids will be gone tomorrow. You and I have to make a living here.
Which is just so sad too. I mean, and there's like a level of like corruption there as well. Like what's like the power dynamic here? What's like the money dynamic here?
Yeah, and it's that small town, like they circle their wagons and kind of, regardless of what is actually right.
Right. Yeah. And like Brando was interested in finding and portraying the real motivation behind the bikers' rebellion. He and producer Stanley Kramer believed it would be a socially relevant project that could make a difference. And it did, just not all in the way that they intended.
Oh, it made a huge difference in American culture. But not so much, not so much in the way they meant. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, Brando was really dissatisfied with the film. He said that it was a failure, and this is a quote from Brando himself. We started out to do something worthwhile, to explain the psychology of the hipster. But somewhere along the way, we went off track. The result was that instead of finding why young people tend to bunch into groups that seek expression in violence, all we did was show the violence.
But also that's such a tricky thing because I feel like that happens a lot in film. I feel like there's a lot of discussion surrounding a lot of films where there's, like violence, whether it's like physical or sexual. There's so many discussions about what's the point of showing it? Like, is it worth it to show it, or is that just traumatizing the audience, or is it important for them to see it?
Oh, yeah. Is it torture porn?
Yeah.
Or is it socially relevant?
Right. Like we still have these discussions today.
Yeah.
Is the thing. Like movies that are coming out today, we're still having those. I mean, even like that movie The Substance that just came out, I've been hearing from a lot of people that it's so, like, people that aren't good with like gore and horror and stuff, like body horror, have been saying like it's so good, except was the body horror really necessary type of thing. And I haven't seen it yet. I really want to, but again, it's just like that just came out. And that's something where almost everyone I've talked to has just been like, why was that necessary? So it's still a thing we're fighting today.
What is gratuitous?
Right. What is the line that we draw where it's like, is this showing enough to get the point across? Or is it just, like just violence for the sake of watching it? Just
and isn't that a line that David Lynch has approached?
Oh yeah,
many times, and some may say has crossed over.
Yeah, because a lot of people do comment on, a lot of the sexual stuff that we see happen in, Twin Peaks and his other works. There's a lot of sexual violence for sure, and I think that I've had many discussions with many people where I say I am a huge David Lynch fan. I love his work, and they'll say, "But Indigo, don't you really care about, like sexual assault and things like that? And like, how can you watch these things?" And I'm like, I know that that's not his intention.
Yeah.
Though. That's the thing, is that when he's showing these things, it's not like he's showing them because he's like, oh, this is like great to watch.
Right.
Yes. It's like there's more to it than that. But people do really get upset about it.
Yeah. I know there's a story of a deleted scene from Wild at Heart, which was Harry Dean Stanton being killed in this incredibly like gratuitous, violent way. And when it was first screened, audiences just walked out.
Oh my gosh.
And so, but that scene was cut out,
Yeah.
obviously. So sure, David Lynch has absolutely toyed with that level of violence that crosses lines for folks.
Yeah.
I think it's very okay. As somebody watching the film The Wild One in 2024,
right,
it's hilarious to me.
It is, yeah,
that this was considered gratuitously violent.
It's like honestly very silly most of the time.
So tame.
Like it's not only tame, but like it's one of those classic situations where you're like watching an older movie and you're just like, this is just kind of silly sometimes.
Yes. What I think was kind of gut-wrenching violence in 1953 is just like two guys punching each other.
Yeah. like it's really tame.
Yeah. In contrast, I know there's a new film called The Bike Riders that's out now that I at first thought, oh, I should see that. I'll bet that would be an interesting comparison with The Wild One. And then I realized, no, it's too violent for me. I couldn't.
Well, yeah, I mean,
see it.
we do not shy away from it now. I'm like rewatching Yellow Jackets right now because it's on Netflix now, and I forgot how they're like, I was like eating, I like got some pizza and I was like eating dinner and I pressed play and I was like, oh, right. Set down the pizza.
Yeah,
Right.
don't feel like eating right now.
Yeah, we don't shy away from the buckets of blood anymore.
No.
And like, so yeah, for them to be like, oh my God, this was so violent. What the heck? We let people watch this? Like, you let them watch two guys punching each other?
I know. It took me some time to kind of process, like, why was this so scary? Because governing bodies across the United States and the world agreed that this was a problem, that this was a controversial film. Like, they agreed with Brando, and the film was banned in a lot of cities.
Which is crazy.
Yeah,
I can't imagine this film being banned.
I know. I mean, the ban's totally backfired.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Because they generated even more interest in the film. Because if you just had to cross a bridge or visit the next town over to see it, a local ban is basically an advertisement.
Right. And like, I mean, that's something that they should have known. That's like, that's classic.
Yeah.
It's like, if you're like, oh, kids, don't watch this, it's really violent. The kids are going to be like, oh, I gotta see this. And they're just gonna call up their friends. They're gonna be like, let's make a plan. Let's make sure we see it.
So it was an ad, you know?
Yeah.
But I have to say that I think for both of us, reading about the impact this film made on American culture, honestly, on the world.
Yeah.
It makes it sound like a spark that ignited a cultural wildfire.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, ultimately, the protectors of the status quo were right to fear the film.
Right.
Because nothing was the same after it.
Yeah, our research makes it clear that Johnny Strabler was basically a catalyst for some of the defining cultural movements of the 20th century. His look, his persona, his what do you got, rebellion, all of it.
Yeah.
Like, Brando was just too appealing to be a villain, really. He's playing this character who maybe we're supposed to see as dangerous, like as a menace, but in the words of Bert Kearns, he's so seductive, so alluring, so damn cool that the viewer had no choice but to identify with him and take the rebel side. I mean, it's a classic problem in Hollywood. Like, I feel like they cast these hotties as the villains, and then they're like, wait, why are all of these teenagers in love with these like
Bad
villains?
boys.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, I wonder why.
You know, I don't know if you've seen Brando in Streetcar Named Desire.
No.
Same kind of thing happened in that. You know, he plays Stanley Kowalski, who we're supposed to hate,
Yeah.
of course. But how could we? How could we hate him? He's so beautiful and charismatic.
It's the charisma that pushes it over the edge. A lot of people out there in the world are good-looking people, but the thing that makes a real star like Brando, that has this like sway over a generation, a whole society, it's the charisma.
Yeah.
It's the charm. And
Yeah.
he had it in a bottle. Like, straight up.
Straight up, yes. And it's so much more powerful than just the image.
Yeah.
You know, the image means nothing until you see it in motion.
Right.
Right. So that's the first thing we're going to talk about in terms of the impact of the film is the general impact that it had on youth culture. And, you know, we've already talked several times about the jacket.
Yeah.
You know, Kearns emphasizes throughout this book, though, that the film wasn't actually marketed to teenagers at all.
Yeah. But there are some obvious reasons, like the fear of glorifying antisocial behavior for young people. But the whole idea of teenager as a distinct demographic that could be even that could even be marketed to was pretty new.
Yeah, it was. Like, according to the exhibition Childhood in Post-War America by the Digital Public Library of America, this is a quote, "The term teenager was first introduced to the American public in the 1940s as a moniker coined by advertising executives.
Classic.
Looking to sell their products to a new audience. The concept of a distinct youth culture had begun to develop in the 1920s, but through the Great Depression and World War II, young Americans were expected to put aside any frivolous activities or unnecessary spending for the sake of the nation's well-being. And then come the 1950s.
And the 1950s were marked by the emergence of a distinct teen culture, seeking to distance themselves from the culture of their parents. Teenagers turned to rock and roll music and youth-oriented television programs and movies, all packaged for them through new marketing strategies targeting their demographic.
Yeah, a mainstream teen culture may have been created by capitalism for capitalism, but youth countercultures arose in the post-war era too. And that's what we see here with The Wild One. Johnny Strabler was right there to represent everything they were feeling inside.
Yeah, and Kearns points out that despite the film not being marketed to teens, despite Brando being 29 when the film was made, Johnny Strabler was most certainly a figure that young people would want to emulate, and Brando knew it.
I love this quote from film critic Pauline Kael. She says this of Johnny Strabler. He was antisocial because he knew society was crap. He was a hero to youth because he was strong enough not to take the crap. There was a sense of excitement, of danger in his presence, but perhaps his special appeal was in a kind of simple conceit, the conceit of tough kids. We in the audience felt protective. We knew how lonely he must be in his assertiveness. Who even in hell wants to be an outsider? And he was no intellectual who could even rationalize it. He could only feel it, act it out, be the wild one. And God knows how many kids felt, that's the story of my life. Isn't that an amazing quotation? That's why I had to read it all.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's so good. And like, God knows how many kids is extremely accurate.
Yeah, it's endless kids.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So here's what we do know about the concrete impact that it made. Marlon Brando as Johnny inspired James Dean, Elvis Presley, and John Lennon.
Which then they went on to be these static images and icons that people tried to emulate.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of how we've talked about with some of like Lynch's work, like with our last episode. It was like, okay, so we don't know that Lynch is necessarily inspired by Alice directly, but we know he's inspired by stuff that was inspired by Alice.
Exactly.
And so it's like even people that are inspired by like John Lennon and Elvis Presley and James Dean, it's like it all goes back to the Wild One.
It all goes back to Marlon Brando.
At the end of the day.
Yeah. All of those, Dean, Presley, and Lennon, they all imitated his look and his persona. Dean and Presley adored Brando and desperately wanted to be like him in their own acting careers.
Yeah, I mean, even if we think about, like, they totally did dress that way. Like, we think of, like, Elvis Presley, like, we think of him, like, you know, like, a baddie in, like, a leather jacket
Jailhouse
or
Rock
something.
is a direct imitation
Yeah.
of Johnny Strabler.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just, like, it makes so much sense when you know the context.
Yeah, I mean, they obviously go on, like you said, to be cultural icons in their own rights.
Right.
But they're just further popularizing this image that Brando created.
And John Lennon and Stuart Sutcliffe were both obsessed with the Wild One in the early days of the Beatles, and the band's original look was an imitation of Johnny's. Burt Kearns details all of the supporting evidence for the band's name coming from the film, too.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of controversy about that, but I love how Kearns breaks down, like, all the support for the idea that, you know, it comes from the Wild One.
Yeah.
Despite the Wild One having no rock and roll music in it whatsoever, only jazz, it left an indelible mark on the development of the genre.
Yeah. I mean, the influence on music didn't stop there, because when the first issue of Punk magazine appeared in 1976, its page one editorial by Joe Koch was titled Marlon Brando, the Original Punk. The article acknowledged Johnny Strabler's influence on artists like Lou Reed and the Ramones, as well as the whole ethos of punk.
Yeah, so we go from rock and roll to punk.
Yeah, like what else?
The tentacles of this character just like span the late 20th
It just
century.
reaches further and further.
He also influenced literature too. There's a line in The Wild One that made me think right away of Jack Kerouac's novel On the Road. So Kathy asks, where are you going to go when you leave here? And Johnny responds, oh man, we just got to go.
Yeah.
That's my very poor Johnny Strabler imitation. There were lots of references in the film to going without any clear destination. And this sentiment is echoed in the 1957 book On the Road. These lines, Sal, we gotta go and never stop going till we get there. Where we going, man? I don't know, but we gotta go.
Yeah.
Like, I struggled to find some confirmation of this connection between the Beats and Brando, and I was really looking for it.
Yeah.
And then I'm reading Bert Kern's book, and there it is. Lucky thing. Jack Kerouac was, in fact, obsessed with The Wild One.
How could he not? Everyone was.
He actually wrote Marlon Brando a letter. He asked him to play Dean Moriarty, Neil Cassidy's character, in the film version of On the Road. And Kerouac wrote, I want you to play the part because Dean, as you know, is no dopey hot rodder, but a real intelligent, in fact, Jesuit Irishman.
I mean, this was like the command that he had over media, though. Like, it was just like...
And over art.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I mean, he was a muse, I think, to a lot of people.
Yes.
He's like a classic muse. He does one thing and people are just like so hyper focused on it for so long.
Yeah, he became a muse for Tom of Finland, right? Johnny Strabler becomes a gay icon.
Yeah, literally. Like, also The Wild One is easily read as a queer-coded film.
We had fun talking about that.
Oh my God, did we?
Yeah, there's really too much to discuss here, but it's really worth reading that film from that point of view.
Yeah, and like with artist Tom of Finland, his illustrations depicting gay men dressed like Johnny Strabler were enormously popular and influential in queer subcultures, and eventually entered mainstream culture during the 70s disco scene. The Leatherman of the Village People is a direct descendant of Johnny Strabler.
Oh, and Andy Warhol, right? He, like the image I saw of Brando, you know, he silkscreened Brando's images as Johnny leaning over the front of his motorcycle, and he supposedly kept a picture of Marlon Brando in his pants.
Oh, did he? Just for emergencies.
For a Marlon Brando emergency.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And then, of course, interest in motorcycle gangs exploded worldwide after the film. Famous leader of the Hells Angels, Sonny Barger, decided to become a biker because of Lee Marvin's character of Chino in The Wild One. The film also inspired a whole new genre of movies, the outlaw biker film.
Yeah, it's just astounding. So we've got all this inspiration in art, in cinema, in music, in literature, in culture, because we have the rise of biker gangs after this. I love this quotation from fashion historian Andrew Lukey. He said, "There is no other piece of pop culture that appears more across different subcultures than The Wild One. It is quite simply the most influential subcultural movie of all time."
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it obviously we've talked so much. It had this insane impact. And I feel like, again, like talking about like modern media, it's like, I think that there's a lot of movies today too where that kind of happens, where like, you know, it popularizes some sort of activity or something. Like each generation does kind of have their thing that they cling to, and this was theirs.
There are always those films that inspire interest in a certain kind of music activity. whatever, but this had such a broad impact.
Right.
You know, I really see what Andrew Lukey's saying.
Yeah,
here.
because this is more than just one thing.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
every part of it.
And then things that go on to be so enormously influential in their own right, the Beatles.
Yeah, right. Again, it's just like it is this like pipeline of iconic people and groups.
All going back to Johnny Strabler, all going back to Marlon
Everything.
Brando. Yeah. So the first most iconic thing, I guess, is just the look.
Yeah.
And this is what Wally Brando imitates as well.
Right.
The interesting thing about this look is, you know, when I first saw the image, I just assumed like, oh, he's dressed like a motorcycle guy.
Yeah, same. I mean, like, that's the thing is, like, I didn't question it at
Yes.
all because I was just like, this is what I know bikers to look like.
Yes.
But he was the first.
He was the first. Yeah, actual bikers, they dressed like the guys in Chino's gang
Yeah.
in the film.
Which that's more like everyday clothes type of
Yeah.
look, like not at all these like, you know, kind of over the top like caricature, like, you know, again, like leather jacket, the hats and everything. Like it was a lot more basic than that.
The look was completely Brando's invention.
Yeah.
These were his clothes.
Yeah.
It was his jacket, his jeans. I mean, he originally wanted to ride his own motorcycle in the film too. We've talked about the shot 618 Perfecto leather jacket. He's wearing a fiddler's cap, Levi's 501 jeans, and engineer's boots. All of these have since become synonymous with a biker look. But that's because of Marlon Brando. It's not something he was imitating.
Right.
He was creating.
Yeah, which is another thing that goes to like that kind of like you know, like the icons that we recognize like
Yeah.
in history and in celebrities. They're these like Lady Gaga or something. It's like, you
yeah.
know, these trailblazers that they create a particular look that anytime anyone is going to see this after that, they're going to say, well, I know what that's from. I know that this you know, this person is dressed up as this person, or I know that, you know, this new artist that has popped up is kind of just imitating this other artist.
But think about it. 50 years will pass, and we
Yeah.
will lose. The culture will lose that train.
Exactly,
And then
because
it'll
we
take-
did.
yeah,
Because,
yeah.
like, again, I did not associate Brando with this at all, and then
No.
now I'm like, oh my god. It's like I feel like Charlie and It's Always Sunny in the classic scene with the red string.
Yes.
He's like, there's no Carol in HR. It's like everything comes back to Brando. No matter what I do to the Pepe Sylvia, it's like everything. Just
Amazing.
I feel like insane. I'm just like crazed with my little cork board.
Literally, a coworker who I hadn't spoken to, I have to admit this, came up on purpose to visit with me, and was like, "Hey, how you doing?" And I literally, this poor man, had to listen to me info dump about Marlon Brando for like 20 minutes.
He's probably just like, okay, thank you.
I was so excited. I was so excited.
Aw.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, it's just when we pick a topic, it does consume our brain.
And this one, it was so worth it.
Yeah.
And I think what really made it worth it is what we get to next when we get to talk about Marlon Brando, the man, the actor, and his impact just generally on film and culture, like as a human being. Astounding. So as influential as this film is, now Marlon Brando himself, amazing.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely redefined masculinity in film.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Brando said, more than most parts I've played in the movies or on stage, I've related to Johnny. And because of this, I believe I played him as more sensitive and sympathetic than the script envisioned. He quotes Johnny's line, "Nobody tells me what to do," and says, "That's exactly how I felt all my life, and have always thought that Johnny took refuge in his lifestyle because he was wounded, that he'd had little love as a kid and was trying to survive the emotional insecurity that his childhood had forced him to carry into adulthood. He was a rebel, but a strong part of him was sensitive and tender."
Yeah, and I think that we see that. I know we both talked about being stunned at that moment when he's crying.
Yeah. It was like I had to do like a double take because when I think of movies in that time period, And I think about like how heavy the toxic masculinity was back then, to be like, you know, a man is the man of the household, you know. But, you know, it's just like you don't picture them as openly like cameras zoomed in on the face. He's crying.
And when he's alone and really vulnerable.
And and he's so expressive in that scene too, beyond just the crying. He's very expressive. Like, he's very fearful and confused and overwhelmed and feeling very alone. And it all really comes across. And like, this is kind of what we said at the beginning of the episode. Like, imagine how many men, they see this idol for them. This is like the man. He's the man. He's the guy everyone wants to be. And he's openly crying. How much that must have done for a lot of men to be like, wait, okay, so Brando is the coolest man alive, and he openly will cry. He's
on
vulnerable.
screen.
On screen. He's vulnerable, and he's showing that it's not shameful to be hiding this. Like, I imagine that must have had a huge impact.
Oh, I mean, look at how it impacted us in 2024.
I know. Yeah, I was just like, oh my God.
Right,
Like, he's crying? Oh my God, is he okay?
Yeah.
Like, I'm so glad that he's you know, vulnerable enough to do this, but also, oh my God, is he okay?
Joe Koch wrote of Brando. He said, Brando was cool without oppressing the audience with too much sharpness. He was powerful without having to be invulnerable. He provided new vicarious life for a public starting to feel intimidated by the always competent film heroes of the 30s and 40s. Vulnerability in a leather jacket.
I love that. That's literally, like, the image is so, you know, he looks like such a tough guy, and then he cries. He looks like such a tough guy, but like, he was known for having really deep friendships with people.
Yeah.
Like,
and you know, even in the film, he's such a tough guy, but when Kathy is basically throwing herself at him,
he's kind of like, which this is also part of the queer reading too,
yes,
to be fair.
it is
he's like, and she's like kind of like, she's like, I'm so tired at this point, just like, do whatever you want to me. And he's like,
he's like, I'm gonna leave, is that what you want? And we're like, clearly not. I love when she's literally stroking his motorcycle and she's like, I've never ridden a motorcycle before.
like, she's like, please do something to me.
She is.
And he's kind of like, oh, what did I get myself into? You know? And it's the same thing too. There's like another, there's a female biker in the movie too that throws herself at him, and every time he's just like,
Yeah. So he comes across as this, like, you know, just incredibly cool guy, but he's like falling apart in front of this small town beauty.
Right.
Like, he doesn't know how to act. It's very sweet.
Yeah, he's like almost a little bit intimidated by her throwing herself at him. He's like done all this work to get here. Yeah. And then the second it's like coming to fruition, he's like, oh my God. It's like, dude, what did you think you were going to do when you got here?
It's so charming.
It's really funny.
It is. I just love that scene so much.
Yeah.
I love this quotation from the author Matthew Redmond. He referred to Brando as the king of effeminacy inside hypermasculinity. Do you see that?
Like, it's like, it's that vulnerable inside a leather jacket. It's this representation of something much harder. But then when you actually like see what's on the inside, it's like, oh no, he's actually incredibly vulnerable, and incredibly human too. It's like he's human, he's flawed, he has these strong emotions, and he's not hiding them at all. Whether it is the emotions of, you know, anger or sadness or fear, he's just an open book.
Yeah, and it's done so subtly.
Yes.
You know, it's not that it's a particular line reading necessarily. It's everything about the way he carries himself, the way he moves his eyes, all of it, you know, and it's such an interesting contrast to the other bikers who are just kind of goofballs.
Yeah, I remember when we first had our meeting to talk about it, I was telling you that what it reminded me of was Labyrinth, like David Bowie.
Yeah.
Which also we were then like, wait, is David Bowie, like, is Jareth, the character, inspired, in looks and personality a bit by the Wild One? Could totally see it. But he's like surrounded by all these like little goblins that are just like running around causing mayhem and being silly. And that's really like his posse of bikers. Like he'll go in and try to like impress Kathy, and they just like all come barreling in, and they're all just like, oh, hey, what you doing, boss, kind of stuff. Like they're just like, it's so silly and cartoonish.
Right.
But again, how I said earlier, they do all kind of have their own personalities.
Yes.
Like as you watch the film, they very clearly, like, I think a lot of those other actors might have been method acting, or they came up with backstories for their characters, because you can tell the difference. Like there's, this one is very much, is going to say a lot of these kinds of things. This one's going to be a lot more like slapstick stuff. This one is, whatever. But they're all these intricate little characters, but they're just this silly posse that just is just always flooding around him.
One of my favorite of those other characters is the one who plays the harmonica, and he was really a jazz harmonica player, and it's just his like effortless rebop talk that follows, where they're kind of teasing Jimmy, the dishwasher in the cafe, and talk. It's just really, really cute.
One of those crazy beers, will you, man? Man, that was real cool, guy. Ex-daddy-o? That's fine old playing. Oh, thank you, Pops. Pop me, Dad. I popped you, Dad. Hey, Pops, thumb me, will you, Daddy-o? Come on, that's it. Thumb me. Now, give me some skin and ooze it out. Just nice. Attaboy. Ooze it out. Now, elbow us. Just elbow us. Pops, do you pick up on this jive, man? What? Did you pick up on this jive, this crazy music here, man? Did you dig the rebop? What? The rebop, Dad. The rebop.
Yeah. So, yeah, I love them. But speaking of Brando as an actor, the film historian Gary Shapiro called Brando's impact on film acting as significant as the transition from silent films. Wow.
Which is saying a lot.
Yeah. So Shapiro says we've got that transition from silent films to films with dialogue.
Yeah.
And then we've got Marlon Brando. They were equally important in the history of American film.
Yeah.
Incredible. That's how much he changed film acting.
And it's, I mean, like, that's saying that he started a new era of film, like a whole 100%. New era.
He started a new era. You're right. Yeah. So he was trained in what was kind of the method, but it was Adler, right? Not the Stanislavski method. He always strove for authenticity, sincerity, and emotional depth.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I feel like every actor after Brando was so influenced by him. Like, all of the greats of the late 20th century were just in awe of him. And so that's going to absolutely affect the way that they act, too.
He's also the first Hollywood star who used his celebrity to advocate for social justice causes.
Right, which is so amazing.
He protested against the death penalty. He attended the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. So, like, right there with Martin Luther King.
Right.
And then, quite famously, he rejected an Oscar.
Yeah. And that was, I remember that was like, that was one of the only things that I knew about him going into this episode, was because I remembered like reading articles and stuff about it, or like every now and then a post would come up on social media where it was like he rejected the Oscar to make the statement about how Native Americans were depicted in Hollywood films by having a Native American person come accept the award and speak on his behalf of the issues that he wanted people to be aware of.
He was so sincere in all of these efforts. I think now we have a little bit of cynicism when stars get involved with...
Right. It feels like, is this just virtue signaling? Is this sincere? Do you actually care? But like, when you started telling me these things, I started like, Googling all this stuff. And like, I was pulling up so many pictures of him with like, all of these like historical figures and stuff, like James Baldwin.
Yeah.
I was like, what? You were besties? Maybe more than besties? You know? Like, that's the other thing, too. I was just like, how many of these were you kissing? I was like, I'm like pulling up all these pictures and I'm like, friends are more than friends. It's like, was it like, oh, and they were, oh, we're roommates, or was it like, and they were roommates?
And Indigo is getting to the point that Brando was openly bisexual.
Yeah,
right?
very openly.
And let's say that that's also in a time when that was not at all.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, so taboo. back
Yeah,
then.
it was so taboo. And he was very open
Yeah.
about his sexuality, in a time when that was quite a courageous, or could be read as a very courageous way to be.
Right.
Yeah.
And openly, was very open about mental health, was open about being in psychoanalysis and helped normalize therapy,
Yeah.
which also was incredibly stigmatized back then.
Yeah, there are some quotations about Brando's devotion to psychoanalysis where journalists were trying to depict him as like, being kind of cuckoo. And he just absolutely refused to take the
Yeah.
bait. And he's like, everyone should be in therapy.
Right.
Everyone should have an analyst.
Yeah. Which is
know?
so true.
Yeah.
Like, that's something that I feel like I say every day to people. It's just like, I just think that everyone should be. I think everyone can benefit from it.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't matter if you've been through some particular trauma or like whatever. It just, the point of it is to help you feel better and like be able to, get tools to get through daily life.
Yeah.
Like,
And
why
it's-
would we feel bad and shameful about that?
Right. It's just so wonderful that in addition to all the other cultural impacts we've got to thank Marlon Brando for, one of them is normalizing therapy.
Right.
Right. Amazing. So he has this huge impact on culture, on film, on just so many aspects of American life.
Right.
And here's the thing, even if it stopped right here, I think we both can agree that there is just not a single chance that Wally Brando is meant to make fun
No.
of this character, this person. And see, I think this was our fundamental misunderstanding before. It was so easy to see Wally Brando as a joke.
Right.
And after learning about Marlon Brando, no way David Lynch or Mark Frost would ridicule.
No. And especially because of the personal relationship between Brando and Lynch.
Yes.
Like, he would not do that to his friend.
Right. David Lynch's personal connection to Marlon Brando is detailed a little bit in Room to Dream. So he tells a story about how he was working on Dream of the Bovine. And he and Harry Dean Stanton went to talk to Marlon Brando. And here, we'll quote David Lynch here, about the two of them doing it together, but Brando hated it. He looked me in the eye and said, "It's pretentious BS." And he started telling us about these cookies he made out of grass that grows in salt water that he wanted to promote. Then he told us about a car he wanted to build that had a bladder underneath it that would cook this grass and make fuel, like the car would digest the grass. You could never tell if Marlon was putting you on or if he was serious. The thing about Marlon was he didn't give about anything. Every business has bad behavior going on, but there's something about this business with all the egos and lies and backstabbing that make you want to do something else rather than be in it. For sure, if anybody had that feeling, it was Brando. He played the game for a while, then he couldn't do it anymore because it made him sick, and he'd reached a point where he just wanted to have fun. In a weird way, I think he was having fun too, and it was fun talking to him.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like they're very kindred spirits in a lot of
yes.
ways. Because, like, again, they have that imaginative quality.
I think reading a lot of things about, when you say they were kindred spirits, reading a lot of things about Marlon Brando, he was such a Hollywood rebel in that, like, he hated being interviewed by the Hollywood press. He would sometimes fall asleep during television interviews. He just never gave the right answers. He just really hated the whole machine.
Yeah. And he was authentically himself,
He was.
which is so Lynch.
It is. So they're both in Hollywood.
Yeah.
And they're also both fighting the system that they need, in a sense.
To be creative to
Yeah.
be different.
Yeah. So I do think that's a source of their kindred spirit. Plus, I love that story in Room to Dream about the tomatoes.
I know. Which is just so quintessential.
Yeah. There's no food in the house, so he just has to feed Marlon Brando a tomato.
Of course, Mr. Two cookies and a Coke. Phenomenal.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about the bikers that we see in Twin Peaks,
Yeah.
right? Because even if we're just looking at the original series,
Right.
bikers clearly influenced by The Wild One
Yeah.
are all over that original series.
100%. I mean, yeah, just like the looks in general, it all just harkens back to, again, that classic look that Brando had really put out into the world. He had created. I mean, James Hurley is clearly an echo of Johnny Strabler, but in keeping with other depictions of bikers in Twin Peaks, James is a force for goodness and order. It's like a role reversal. Like Laura is the deeply troubled lost kid who's sometimes mean, and James is like in Kathy's place, where he's like the trying to save her from herself with his love. He's, like this kind of quiet townsfolk,
Yeah, I think it's so interesting how in Twin Peaks it's as if, over the course of the late 20th century, the bikers and law enforcement have found common ground.
Yeah.
Now they are united in the bookhouse.
Right.
Right. They are all bookhouse boys. Right.
Right.
So our sheriff's department staff, they're bookhouse boys.
Yeah.
And so are all these bikers.
Right. And it's like in the movie, like Johnny talks about how much he hates cops.
I don't like cops.
Yeah, he like refuses to work with them.
Yeah, and that's actually what makes him want to leave town despite
Yeah.
Kathy, is
Yeah.
because her dad's a cop.
Right.
Yeah. I like this quote from Lynch on Lynch, where Chris Rodley says, James is interesting in that he's a biker, and all the bikers in this town seem to hang out at the Roadhouse listening to a very angelic Julie Cruz singing beautifully melancholic songs, as opposed to, biting the heads off of chickens.
Yeah.
David Lynch answers, right, see, the idea was that the bikers in Twin Peaks were the intellectuals, the beatniks. The jocks were the ones outside listening to something completely different. They were very much a cerebral bunch of bikers.
Right. Well, and even thinking of Julie Cruz, we had talked about that iconic look of her where she basically is wearing the Johnny Strabler look.
In the pilot.
Yeah. Like she's got the hat, she's got the jacket, she's got the look.
Yeah. And they're all sitting around listening to this beautiful angelic singer.
Yeah.
And the ruffians who come in and disturb the peace are the squares.
Right.
It's Mike and Bobby.
Right. It's the jocks. Like it's James is like this, soft-spoken, like emotional, careful person. And instead the rowdiness is like the classic townspeople.
Yeah. So we've got like Lynch and Frost in the original series seeming to make some kind of statement.
Yeah.
About the role that bikers are going to play in this town. And it's a very wholesome, very force for good. Do you have any theories about why the cops and the bikers have united?
Well, I think that so again, if we're thinking about the sort of respect that Brando commands, and thinking about the way that they wanted to represent the bikers in The Wild One, in the way that he felt like it kind of went awry, I could totally see this as them trying to do a service to that, of being like, wait, this is what you wanted, right? You wanted them to be the intellectuals and the beatniks and the creatives, the empaths. You wanted it to be them, right?
Yeah.
And, and again, it's that what Brando asked for of, the townspeople are the ones committing the violence, the real intense violence, or at least the intentional violence. So I definitely think of it as, now that we know all of this, I've been thinking about it and thinking that I wonder if this is another way where they're sort of paying respect to a friend and a peer.
Yeah. In Marlon Brando.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that.
How about you?
I've also thought maybe it's a testament to how powerful the evil in the woods is. Whatever is out there in the woods of Twin Peaks
Right.
is so bad that even these natural enemies of cops and bikers have united forces as the Bookhouse Boys to oppose it. Like they have a larger enemy, and so they've found their common purpose.
Yeah.
You know, in being a force for good.
Which, I mean, I could totally see, because then we also have like the redemption arc of like Bobby. You know, we have a lot of characters that they grow so much during the series, and it's so great to see them, especially like in the return of how maybe their lives have kind of done a 180 because they have all banded together. Yeah, to just like fight what darkness is leaching into the town.
Right. You know, and I also think that learning about the Wild One, even though we were focused on Wally Brando, it's helped me understand James a little more.
Yeah, no, same, I know. It's like one of those things where I'm like, oh my God, I kept making fun of him.
Oh, we all do.
Yeah,
right?
you know, but it's like Lynch insisted on, you know, he was like, James has always been cool. We've got the line, James has always been cool.
And that is for all of us fans who
Yeah.
disagreed.
I know, because we all made memes about it. You know, there's so many memes about it. And it's just like, again, thinking of this idea of like Wally Brando being silly or something, but then knowing in the back of my mind, but everything he does is intentional.
Yeah.
So like, why would he be putting, and not to say that he isn't funny, he definitely puts in stuff for humor, but there's something about it where it's like, okay, so you put this in here, but I have this strong feeling it's not necessarily for humor.
Right.
So what's behind that?
Right. You know, James's absolute sincerity and insistence on being good and loving, and everything, like it makes him kind of a joke.
Yeah.
But you know, if Brando brought vulnerability in a leather jacket, so does James.
Right. I mean, he's definitely very emotional and empathetic. And you know, he's so deeply heartbroken over Laura. And I know, like, just thinking about, like, in general, you know, I kind of mentioned Bobby. We talked about also, that's another example of, like, Bobby, we see Bobby cry.
Yeah.
We see Bobby open up and be vulnerable.
In The Return in particular. I mean, we do see it in season 1.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, you know, David Lynch is also someone who is not afraid to have men cry.
Oh, absolutely. And so when we see Marlon Brando as Johnny Strabler crying in 1953 in The Wild One and kind of rocking the world, you know, David Lynch has very much worked in that same tradition. I have some quotes.
Go off. Do it.
Go off on my quotes. Again, from Lynch on Lynch. Chris Rodley brings up Deputy Andy Brennan crying in the pilot, right?
Andy.
Yeah.
I mean, how can we not bring up Andy?
One of our favorites. And he says, "You seem to like crying. Is that true?" And Lynch responds, "Yeah, I guess. I'm big on that. Girls crying, men crying, women crying, crying in general. It's powerful if they are really feeling it. It's like a yawn. It transfers over. Like Andy, he's a man and he's crying. It's a rare thing, you know, to see a policeman crying. It comes from Roy Orbison, I guess." I think it comes from Marlon Brando.
Yeah.
No, in this case, it's when something cements this identification and it's unleashed, when the person can't speak the rest of the sentence and chokes up in a certain way, and you're gone. You know that feeling, and it sweeps over you.
And it does. I mean, that's the thing is, he also does, I think, I mean, we've talked before about how careful his casting is. And I think that when he is having these characters cry, it's always very powerful.
Yeah.
I mean, like, for all of my Donna hate, like, I mean, it is an iconic image of her crying in the classroom.
Oh.
It's gut-wrenching. She honestly does nail it. I mean, like, her body is shaking. It's like she is just racked with sobbing.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of the characters, the way that different actors in Twin Peaks cry, it's always so interesting because it's very personal to them. And the way, like, you know, like you know, whether it's like a single tear from Audrey or something, you know, just like a quiet crying.
Or Sarah Palmer breaking down on the phone, you know, where she's just shrieking in agony.
Like I'm getting
crying.
chills just like thinking of these scenes right now. And you know, and we've got our men of Twin Peaks that are, you know, and I mean, when we see Andy cry, it's, I mean, I will, you know, die on this hill that, I mean, I think everyone else is on this hill as well. Like, we're all dying on the hill of, like, Andy must be protected at all costs. Like,
Yes.
And I mean, that's another thing, too, with Wally, is that, like, Andy and Lucy are literally two of the most pure and beloved characters.
Yes.
They are shining beacons of like tenderness in such a dark town. And like for this to be their son, to be raised by these incredibly loving, kind, gentle people, how could he be a joke? It's one of those things that when we started really analyzing it, I was like, there's no way that he can be a joke, because in the same way that people mistake Andy and Lucy for a joke.
Yes.
They're not. They're genuinely sincere, good people.
They can be funny.
They can be funny for sure. But like at the end of the day, they are important, sincere characters. And so of course their son would be as well.
Yeah. You know, I think one thing that's very interesting and a wonderful transition for us is that the scene right before Wally Brando's appearance is Bobby breaking down over that picture of Laura Palmer.
Right.
So the most raw, powerful crying that I think we might see in The Return.
I know. Even just thinking about it, I'm like getting chills and I want to cry.
You know, Deputy Jesse like interrupts that scene, and then after Andy and Lucy leave with him to see Wally, Bobby continues sobbing there, you know, just looking at Laura's picture and crying. I think it's so beautiful that we have this bad boy rebel who just gradually has revealed all this depth, tenderness, and real emotion. This breakdown, though, you know, I remember on other podcasts, people being really uncomfortable with Bobby's breakdown and just thinking like his unabashed emotion is like too much. You know?
Which is just so completely opposite from what Brando would have pushed for and what Lynch would push for. It's like, again, for me, I just also cried. I'm very much like if I see a character that I love cry, I'm crying.
You know, I feel like it's appropriate too.
Yeah.
Given what that image of Laura Palmer meant in Bobby's life.
Talk about static images.
Yeah. Oh, well, exactly, right? If Marlon Brando on this bike is a static image that resonates. Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Classic picture that everyone, I mean, it's like, I think we talked about this when we were first going over making notes and stuff, that it's like, surely there were other pictures of her, but we see almost none of them. Like the pictures that we see every time somebody's like, here's a picture of Laura Palmer, it's always that one.
The homecoming photo.
It's the classic static image that she is frozen in time in this one outfit with this one hairdo. And that's how these people see her and remember her.
If Twin Peaks had come out a few years earlier, Andy Warhol definitely would have silkscreened Laura Palmer.
Yeah, would have been obsessed with her because she was pretty and blonde.
And the power of that static image. Yeah, definitely. So I think that scene of Bobby's just raw, strong emotion, very much in the spirit of Brando, just leads so beautifully into our most direct allusion, finally, to the Wild One. So now we just get to talk about Wally Brando, but actually not quite, because we have more Marlon Brando stuff to talk about.
But it's because it goes in hand with why his name is Wally Brando.
Why is his name Wally Brando?
Because I when you first approached me about the Wild One, I was like, oh, yeah, duh, Wally Brando. He shares a birthday with, okay, duh. But I was like, I still don't get where the Wally's coming from.
But we found it. So our theory, and it's not much of a stretch, is that this is a combination of the names Wally Cox and Marlon Brando. So Wally Cox and Marlon Brando were best friends from age 9 Though best friends is a vast understatement, and in our notes I had to directly quote you, Indigo. Go ahead.
When we were first talking about it, like Hillary was, just like unraveling all of this for me and telling me everything. And once she had kind of laid the groundwork of it, my immediate response was, it's giving Achilles and Patroclus. Literally, he wanted his remains. This is what prompted me to say that, was that you were like, yeah, he insisted on getting, like, Wally Cox was married and he was like, give me his ashes. To the wife, he was like, give me his ashes. They're mine.
Let's get to that. It's wonderful. Yeah. I 1,000% agreed with it's giving Achilles and Patroclus.
He's like, I'm going to hold on to my love of my life's remains and be real weird about it, maybe.
Brando and Wally Cox were almost complete opposites.
Yeah.
Brando's this icon of masculinity, and Cox was droll and owlish. Like, he's best known for being the voice of underdog.
Yeah, because I remember when we were talking about it, and I was like, I'm looking at the pictures, but I'm trying to really picture this guy. And as I looked through his roles, I was like, wait, I've heard his voice. I know underdog.
Yeah. He was also famous for the portrayal of Mr. Peepers in the eponymous 1950s television show, which we've had an opportunity to watch some clips from.
And it is insane.
Yeah, we're excited to tell you what we have discerned from these clips of Mr. Peepers.
But so Wally Cox's sister, Eleanor Robinson, said the same things amused them. There was always much laughter when they were together, and they had similar attitudes towards fame and publicity. They were among the first generation of actors who fled from the press and hid from the public. And they were both intellectuals and extremely intelligent and had lofty conversations on unusual subjects. They were birds of a feather.
I just love this idea that they were just these like absolute best of friends from childhood, And
again, these complete opposites. I mean, really complete opposites.
Right. Physically, anyway. Yeah. Well, Wally Cox died unexpectedly at only 48.
Yeah.
And there's an article in 2004 in the Los Angeles Times. It was by Robert M. Welkos called When the Wild One Met the Mild One. It was about the death of Wally Cox and Brando's actions after it.
Yeah, and I remember when you were telling me about this, like, I think I started crying a little bit just picturing it because, so, like, Brando attended Cox's celebrity-studded wake in 1973 by climbing in a back window of the house and just hiding the entire, whole time in the room where Wally died. And when asked about it later, Brando said, Wally was my friend, nobody else's. Like, I mean, it just sounds like his soulmate died.
Yeah.
It sounds like half of himself died.
Yeah.
And that kind of pain, there's nothing like it.
And then, as you already said, he convinced Wally Cox's widow to let him have his ashes. He said he was going to scatter them in the hills where Cox loved to hike, but he didn't.
No.
He kept them. Marlon Brando kept Wally Cox's ashes in a drawer in his home on Mulholland Drive.
Mulholland Drive.
And sometimes he drove around with them in his car.
Which is literally Achilles and Patroclus. He's like, I'm just going to carry around the remains of my loved one and keep them with me. Even if it's gross and weird, I don't care.
But how about this beautiful ending?
Yeah.
Because Marlon Brando dies at age 80 in 2004, and their ashes are scattered together in Death Valley. Wally Cox and Marlon Brando's ashes scattered together. I mean, it's a love story.
Right. Like they are finally together in this way.
So here's the thing. Wally Brando is born on Marlon Brando's birthday, April 6th.
Right.
Many other fans have pointed out that this is not possible. The timeline is not timelining. The facts of the original series, when Lucy finds out she's pregnant, blah, 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 like, it's... Yeah.
Right.
So this is a super, super deliberate thing. Lynch and Frost, they really want Wally born on Marlon Brando's birthday. So here's our theory.
Yeah. our theory is that Wally Brando is basically a reincarnation of these two best friends whose ashes were scattered together. They were like intermingled together to create this new body, this new person out of those ashes. And it's Wally. It's Wally Brando.
Yeah. And so there is no way that this character is a joke.
No, because again, it's just there's no way that David would disrespect his friend.
And I don't think Mark Frost would either.
No,
I don't know
no.
anything personally about Mark Frost's connection to Marlon Brando,
Right.
but I am just going to go out there and say I'm sure he shares this kind of reverence for this man.
Right. Yeah. I mean, especially, like anyone of that time period really would. And so it's like, there's no way that this character is a joke. This is clearly, connecting these two people that were so close to each other. And it's almost like we kind of talked about how there's so much media out there, like books, movies, what have you, where artists and creators and creatives make art that is to sort of process grieving or pay respect to people that they love that have passed on. And so this sort of feels like Lynch's attempt and success, I would say, to pay respects to a friend that is gone by giving him what he would want, which is that his soul is finally fully connected with Wally's. And, again, like maybe they have been reincarnated into this form by their ashes being scattered and shared together.
And there are so many wonderful... Okay, so one thing we both really liked, I mean, obviously, physically, Michael Cera is much smaller than Marlon Brando in his prime, but he's dressed absolutely like Brando.
No, even down to the embroidered jacket and everything.
100% a visual allusion to Marlon Brando.
Right.
But how about that dialogue?
Right. And also just the voice, too, that Michael Cera's putting on, which a lot of people make fun of. They're like, what is this weird voice he's doing?
Yeah.
Well, we figured it out.
Yes. And you can too, listeners.
Yeah.
By just watching some episodes of Mr. Peepers.
Hilary pulled up some clips for me, and I think my jaw was just like dropped, like on the floor. I was just like, oh my God, that's it.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
And it's not only the way he speaks, which is very kind of soft and gentle.
And there's kind of a lisp to it.
A little bit of a lisp.
Yeah.
And by the way, Marlon Brando's not speaking in his usual voice and accent in The Wild One.
Yeah.
But he's imitating Tennessee Williams.
Right.
Because why not?
Yeah. He can do anything he wants, pretty much, honestly. That's a Brando way.
That's a whole other layer. Right. But it's not only the way Michael Cera is speaking there, it's also the way the dialogue is patterned.
Yeah.
So here, first we're going to listen to a bit from the pilot of Mr. Peepers, where he's describing how hard he studied to be a teacher.
Yeah.
And go ahead, we're going to play this clip.
Hey, Mr. Watt. Well, I'm sorry, but I've been sitting there for 2 hours doing nothing. When do I begin to help you teach?
Well, as a matter of fact, I've gotten along perfectly well without you before, and I shall continue to do so.
I was assigned here by the Board of Education. They sent me here to teach. I studied very hard to get my teaching degree. I studied day and night. And the afternoon. And during my lunch hour. Day and night.
So, what does that sound like to us in Wally's dialogue?
Yeah, I mean, because it's got this like circular pattern to it. And so it looks a lot like this scene from Twin Peaks.
My shadow is always with me.
Mm-hmm. Wally Brando says, my shadow is always with me, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes to the left, or sometimes to the right, except on cloudy days or at night.
I studied in the morning and I studied morning and night and afternoons and on my lunch break.
Like it's just, again, it's like this like weird like over explaining kind of circular way of talking, and it's like the dialogue matches so well.
There's another clip in a later episode of Mr. Peepers where he's talking to some of his students, and he goes on this long, weird speech about like the construction of Boulder Dam,
Right.
and like what Boulder Dam has done, and it made me laugh out loud. I thought of him saying like, I think about Lewis and his friend Clark. You know, it's like this very long, rambly story. But the thing about
and the kids are just standing there like, okay. They're like, okay, sir.
yeah, but like Mr. Peepers is sincere and earnest.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, 100%.
And the funny thing about the few clips I've seen of this show is he is funny, but the other characters are also absurd. You know, the other characters who are more, quote, like normal, they're kind of the joke. And he's just here being his sort of sweet, quirky self.
Right.
So he's not the target of ridicule in the show, as far as I could tell.
Right.
But yeah, so we've got the visual of Marlon Brando, but we seem to have the speech pattern or something else of Wally here.
Yeah, like the diction as well.
So if we've got this lovely reincarnation of these two best friends and soulmates in this character, that's a good reason to assume he is not a joke. But then there is the actor Michael Cera.
Right, who is known for comedy stuff. So it's like, okay, yes, this is meant to be this meaningful character. So then why Michael Cera? Well, we've thought about it. Don't you worry.
Our first theory is about, Brando redefines masculinity for mid-20th century film.
Yeah.
And how about Michael Cera?
Right. I mean, that was like very much like my generation of like kind of like the indie kids of the early 2000s. My friends and I were watching these movies where there was just an era where it was Michael Cera and Jesse Eisenberg and all these other actors that they were becoming the new heartthrobs of Hollywood, and they were like these like nerdy guys that were like not like the stereotype, like they weren't like Brad Pitt, but they had this like cuteness to them that made them these romantic leads, and they redefined masculinity as like, again, when you think of a romantic lead, you think of like, Brad Pitt or Tom Cruise or, I don't know who else, like all of those like, heartthrobs of like the 80s or 90s or whatever. But in the early 2000s, it was like, okay, no, the new heartthrob is these like sensitive, nerdy guys. They're like kind of awkward, kind of shy and quiet, and like they get drawn out by like kind of manic pixie dream girl, which questionable, but yeah, it's like he became the new leading man.
Yeah. And that's so great. It's like another redefinition then of masculinity in film.
Yes.
Yeah. So much in the spirit of Brando doing the same. Yeah. I also think that part of the reason we have to take Michael Cera seriously in this role is because of how David Lynch and Michael Cera met.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in Room to Dream, Michael Cera is quoted talking about learning transcendental meditation. And he and Eric Edelstein were there with another friend doing their introductory course. And Cera recalled, quote, "On the first day, a woman who works there approached us and said, 'Would you guys like to meditate with David?' We were stunned and said that would be amazing, but we kind of took the invitation with a grain of salt. Then a month or so later, she called and said, 'How about Thursday at David's house?' It was just him and us. And it was so open of him to have strangers into his home. He was so kind that I lost the sense of being an intruder, and we meditated together. And it was one of the most special things that ever happened to me."
I mean, like, I don't even know what I would do in that situation. If I was at a TM event, and because listeners, if you remember, both Hilary and I practice. If I was at one of those like larger TM events or something, and somebody comes up and they're like, "What's up? Do you want to meditate with David Lynch?" I think I would like throw up and like pass out.
I'm pretty sure I wouldn't be able to meditate.
Yeah, I would do like the classic and not like this would be an act. Like it would just be the first time that I've ever actually like done the classic, lady fainting. Like I would just be like, and fall backwards. But theoretically, I'd be sitting comfortably because you would
Yes,
for TM. So at least I would be, it wouldn't be a hard fall or anything.
When I first went for my TM course, I know we have the same teacher, Marty. Marty said like, "Oh, why are you interested in TM?" And I was like, because of David Lynch.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he kind of looked at me and I was like, "Have other people said that?" And he was like, "Yes."
But the thing that is so great about Marty, and this actually goes back to what we talked about earlier with the Beatles, is that the Beatles also practice TM. So it's like that's like another thing in the weird Venn diagram of like all this crossover.
Yeah.
And that's what got Marty into it. Was like, "Oh, I heard the Beatles did it." And so I'm like, "Well, Marty, the new thing is that the kids are like, oh, David Lynch does it." In your generation, it was, oh, the Beatles do
Beatles.
it.
Yes, that's so true. That is so true. Here's another fun Beatles connection. Mm-hmm. One of the sources that we've called on here for our analysis of Wally Brando is a practicing Gaudiya Vaishnav, who, and that's the same faith that George Harrison was part of. Mm-hmm. And so this person was kind enough to spend a good 2 hours with me explaining Dharma. Mm-hmm. Because that line Wally Brando has, "My Dharma is the road." Yeah. I didn't feel comfortable just looking up definitions of Dharma online.
Yeah.
So I sought out someone who practices. Yeah. He asked me to specify that he's a Gaudiya Vaishnav because he said other denominations, other sects of Hinduism have different takes on it. So all of our information is coming from that point of view on this. And then I asked him to watch the Wally Brando scene. And he was like, "Well, I don't have context." And I was like, no. Just give me your spiritual interpretation. So we're going to share some of what we what we learned from that and kind of what we're analyzing here in this sense. So we've got Michael Cera meeting David Lynch in this very spiritual context.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, so again, to the question of, okay, so we've made all these connections that it's like, okay, yes, this is an important character, but still, why Michael Cera? It's like, well, because he and Lynch had this spiritual connection, this moment of spiritual connection, and he's someone that can understand what David is trying to get across in this point.
Okay, so we're going to finish our analysis here of Wally Brando by asserting that Wally Brando is not just not a joke.
Right.
He is an enlightened being.
Yeah, because again, if we're seeing him as this reincarnation of Wally Cox and Marlon Brando, then he would be this enlightened being, which he does really carry that.
Yeah.
And the stuff that he is saying, it does come across.
Yeah.
Like, again, it's easy to misread it as this kind of like looping, potentially strange way of talking. But if you look at it through the lens of, what if he's this enlightened reincarnated being? Mm-hmm. It makes a lot more sense.
It does. For one thing, his little spiel about the shadow, right, which is very funny. My shadow is always with me. Right. He's implying he's always with his shadow. This seems to imply an awareness of and unity with what's usually repressed or hidden. Yeah. This is what Jung called the shadow. Mm-hmm. We see the opposite happening with Cooper.
Right.
And his divided self.
Right.
Cooper's shadow is not always with him. He's repressed it. And now, here in season 3, he's split.
Right. And that is something that also comes up so much in Twin Peaks. The doppelgangers, the shadow selves.
The dweller on the threshold.
Yes. Just the general darkness that seeps out from the Black Lodge.
Yeah. But Wally is like one with the shadow.
Right.
It's like
He's
he knows
made peace with it.
He knows it. He understands it. It's riding with him.
Right.
Except on cloudy days and at night, which is very funny. Right. We also see this really nice moment where Wally pauses, and then he makes this announcement that he is renouncing his childhood bedroom.
Right.
So his relinquishing of his childhood bedroom could be read as a decisive renunciation of material connections and a detachment from material life that would be characteristic of the transition to sannyasi, which is the fourth and final stage or ashram of spiritual life in Hindu tradition. So it's kind of like the kind of ultimate goal,
Right.
in a way. Like,
yeah, that like ultimate enlightenment.
well,
Or-
you're almost there.
Okay,
Like
okay.
you're closer to achieving moksha, right? Of like leaving samsara, like the cycle of death and rebirth.
Gotcha.
If you can get there to sannyasi. So, but what's required of it is like this renunciation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like Wally, a sannyasi is usually itinerant and wandering from place to place. You know, they don't have a fixed home.
Right. He's traveling. He's learning a lot too in his travels.
Yeah.
That he's carrying that knowledge with him as well.
Absolutely. So like there's that weighty pause before his announcement.
Yeah.
You know, it's just not just giving up a room.
Right.
It's like, it's really cute too because Lucy and Andy really want him to give up the room. You know, it's like, it's a matter of grave concern.
Yeah.
And they are just so delighted
Right.
when he does. So, I mean, like, this could look absurd if you're like, Lucy and Andy want a study so bad that they're like squealing about this. But so, my Gaudiya Vaishnav source said, you know, the role of parents would be to educate and prepare the child to make the types of choices that would help them on the path of devotion or bhakti. So Lucy and Andy, as good parents, would be hoping for Wally to make this choice.
Right.
And would be so thrilled that he does.
Right.
Right? That he's willing to renounce this connection to the material world.
And like keep moving forward on this path and this journey.
Yeah, because he's actually right about the right age too. So the brahmachari or student life usually ends around 25, and so that's about how old Wally would be. And then the person usually transitions to either grihasta or like householder life, or could skip directly to sannyasi. So that's apparently what Wally's done.
Right.
Yeah. The goal of this final stage is liberation. For some traditions, this means a release of the soul from the cycle of death and rebirth. The sannyasi could also teach and preach, especially to those who are too distracted by their householder or grihasta duties.
And it seems like when he's going through these like monologues and some of the lines that he has, it's like he is trying to like impart this kind of enlightened wisdom.
To Frank.
Yeah. He's like, I got to tell you this stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And look at the way Andy and Lucy are flanking him and keep looking.
Yes. Like, are you hearing him?
Yes.
Are you listening? Like, this is for you.
Yeah. Like, they are very earnest.
Right.
And, you know, on a first watch of The Return, I know I was like, what the heck? Why are they so excited about this weirdo?
Right.
But by the end, when we see the role that Lucy and Andy play in the overall arc of this story, we have to take them seriously here.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, 100%. Like how we said earlier, it's just like they really are extremely vital characters to this story, to the town of Twin Peaks.
Yeah. And to its ultimate salvation.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's there again. I think it has a lot to do with the amount of like purity, but not in the sense that, you know, I don't know, like a Christian sense or anything like that. It's just like they truly have goodness in them. They have these like this purity in their souls, where they are so full of like love and tenderness and empathy and wanting to protect the people around them. And it is that kind of energy that can salvage this.
The thing that this really reminds me of visually is when Andy is taken up into the fireman's palace and he's shown all those images.
Yeah.
And we see Laura Palmer flanked by those angels.
Yeah.
We see Laura Palmer's picture and the two angels. That's kind of recreating this image of Wally and Lucy and Andy on either side, kind of flanking him. You know, I think they're, like you said, they're here trying to say, are you listening,
Right.
Frank Truman?
Yeah.
Do you hear
this
what?
is important.
This is important. And the message Wally is here delivering, love.
Yeah.
Right? Definitely a message of love. I know we've both read John Bernardi's article from 2017 in 25YL, where he says, Wally's here representing love, and there's not enough of that
Right.
in the return. So that's really important.
Right.
But there's also this this issue of Dharma,
Yeah.
because this is how he ends. He says to Frank, your Dharma. And he gives this vague gesture. A lot of fans seem to interpret this as he's telling Frank, your Dharma is Twin Peaks. But he doesn't say that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so my Gaudiya Vaishnav source
Yeah.
was quick to point that out, that if Wally is in like a teaching role here,
Right.
he's emphasizing for Frank the importance of working in his own Dharma, but he is not telling him what it is. He's not presuming to know what it is. He's just like, this matters.
Right.
And you must
Right.
find it and connect with it and work in it. So, you want to talk about Dharma a little?
Yeah.
Yeah. Dharma, if you like look it up online, right, you're going to see like duty or responsibility.
Okay.
But it's much more significant than that. It is the definition that my source gave me was, quote, that which is constantly existing within a particular object.
Okay.
Yeah. So he described it as light and heat are fire.
Okay.
Right? You can't have fire without light and heat. And that is what Dharma is like to a person. It is
Interesting.
essential nature. It is hardwired way of being. It is like a primary duty that is inherent within you. So animals, right?
Yeah.
Animals are acting their Dharma, but they don't have free will. So they're acting on instinct. Human beings, we have free will.
Yeah.
And so we can choose to act out of accordance with Dharma, but it is not going to work out well for us.
Okay.
If we do that.
Yeah.
So the idea with Dharma is that whatever it is better that you do that work, and work is in quotation marks here. It's better to do your Dharma imperfectly than to do another's perfectly. Because we can't think of work and duty in the capitalistic sense,
Right. Right.
if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I think that does. Like, especially in this context, it's like, yeah, I wouldn't say that the vibe I'm getting from this is very much not that they want you to work in an office and be a cog in the machine type of thing. I don't know.
For sure,
Yeah.
for sure. So, like, it could sound really absurd for Wally to say, my Dharma is the road.
Yeah.
If we only understand Dharma as responsibility or duty, like, whose duty is the road?
Right.
Right? Like, as Westerners, as capitalists, people from a
Right.
capitalist culture, like, that is not going to make any sense to us.
We're like you work on the road.
Yeah. What do you do for money?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, that's like everybody's first question is just like, okay, but what have you been doing? Like, where have you been working and stuff? But that doesn't seem to be a concern to him. Like, that's not and not that we get the idea that he's like a trust fund kid. It's just like, it seems like he's got bigger things to deal with.
Yeah. According to my source.
Yeah.
In a kind of perfect society, everyone would do their Dharma or live in their Dharma, and the society would be mutually supporting. And so a sannyasi is supported by those who are just in the community, because the community recognizes that a sannyasi is doing this important spiritual work, and so he wouldn't need to, work at Target.
Right. Yeah. No, which I think like
Yeah.
that's a thing that like I feel like we as a society, I feel like especially in the last like 5 to 10 years, there's been like a noticeable push for people being like, we need to do this less. Like there needs to be less capitalism. There needs to be 4-day work weeks. There needs to be like people need time to rest. I think honestly, like the pandemic taught a lot of us that like we were pushing ourselves a lot. We needed to be resting more. We needed to be focusing on our creativity more. Because that was like the beauty of it, was that like during lockdown, one of the few good things that was coming out of that was a lot of people were getting back into hobbies and like making art and like writing. I know, like for me, like I'm a baker, and like I used that time to bake a lot of things that I never had time to try, like new recipes that I had been really wanting to do. I made a lot of really great food for myself. I read a lot of books. I got back into reading as a hobby. Like there were a lot of things that I was able to finally have this time and energy to like actually pursue things that I love and that make me who I am. And I feel like I've talked with a lot of friends that have felt the same way, where it's like, and we don't know how then when we had to return to normal, like how do you just jump back in after you've seen how sweet it could be when you have the time to create?
We were living our dharma.
We were.
Yeah.
And okay.
Your dharma is baking.
Yeah. I mean, I like
one of your.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just like, I wonder like what that says to like a larger view of like, if it has to be something that drastic and insane to happen in the world for people to finally connect with that, to really finally connect with their dharma. That's so sad.
Yeah.
It has to be this horrible tragedy that like left a lot of lives lost and people isolated in their homes. Because I mean, on top of all that, there were also a lot of people that really struggled with depression by being isolated by that.
And lots of economic impacts.
Yes, lots of economic impacts. Again, like just so many people lost their lives or became, had health complications afterwards.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, we're not glorifying
No.
the pandemic. Yeah.
So it's just like, but it is so sad that like, okay, so something this drastic and terrifying and horrible has to happen just for people to be able to finally have a moment to connect with their dharma.
Yeah.
That's so sad for us as a society then.
It took that dramatic of a disruption.
Right. Like this is the world we're living in?
Yeah.
Oh no.
Yeah. And is that then why we laugh at Wally Brando?
Right.
Because here he is so earnestly knowing and living his dharma that as Westerners in a capitalist society, we have to laugh at that.
Right. Well, I think that it's just so interesting. It's just really like, what is it about this idea of like enlightenment or even just striving for that, or like striving to make these kind of connections or take time for yourself, take care of yourself. Why is it shameful or
why
laughable?
is it funny? Yeah.
Why is it funny that these people are on this path?
Right. Is it because they are such a challenge to the system at large? I mean, a Wally Brando, right, is just
a rebel with a cause.
He's a rebel. We're bringing it full circle.
We're bringing it back.
Yeah, he is this sweet angelic rebel against the dominant capitalist system.
Right.
His dharma is the road.
His dharma is the road. He is traveling. He is learning. He is having experiences. He is meeting new people. And all of that is leading to his enlightenment for sure.
Yeah, beautiful. So it's like we see Twin Peaks giving this strange and wonderful moment to the imagined combined souls of Wally Cox and Marlon Brando.
Yeah.
It's like the implication is that each one alone was somehow lacking in something they needed to be able to advance, to get back. It's like they're reincarnated in this soul that's on its final leg of its journey back to Godhead. Because as my source, my friend said, that's what it's always about, the return. And he used that language, which kind of gave me shivers. And he was like, all of these actions, all of these stages, all of this searching is about the return. We are always trying to get back to the divine.
Yeah.
And I asked, like, is it similar to like the fall,
Yeah.
in Christian tradition? And he said, no, it's different, and it's always a loving return that, in this particular tradition, right? God, the divine, always is yearning for that reconnection. And so all of these kind of cycles of death and rebirth are about that return. Ultimately. And so it's kind of lovely to think that Lynch and Frost are giving us this little vision of Marlon Brando and Wally Cox, maybe on their last trip. Right.
Like they've finally kind of merged their souls. They found this kinship in each other where it was so clear that they were like two halves of a whole.
Yeah.
I mean, to the point of like mixing their ashes together. Like what more can you take away from that kind of connection? Like, it's so in your face. Like, you have to, like, actively fight against it to, like, not see it.
Right.
Which I'm sure there are people out there that would love to do that. They hate to see two men potentially in love. But yeah, it's like they found this connection in each other. They held on tight, and then now they're being rewarded for it by getting closer and closer.
Yeah. And there's this little vignette then in Twin Peaks where we're given this kind of beautiful moment, this beautiful character of Wally. So
we love Wally Brando now.
Way more than ever before. And what a payoff, I think, for both of us to learn about Marlon Brando.
Yeah.
To fall in love with this actor, this person. And I just adore this film, The Wild One, now.
Yeah, no, same. I mean, it's one of those things where I think we probably talked about it, that like now I really want to go through and watch a lot of his other movies.
Oh, yeah.
And like now I feel this push to do it.
Yeah.
Because it's just one of those things where it's like it got the ball rolling of like, wait, this is him?
Yeah.
This is what he's up to? Okay. This I can get behind.
Yeah. For sure.
Yeah.
So it's, once again, the payoff, It's so fun exploring these little side streets off of Twin Peaks, because then all these other layers of richness and beauty and history and all kinds of things open up for us. So we've had so much fun researching and talking about this, and we hope you have too, listeners.
Yes. Yeah, this was a really fun one because I think we both went in pretty blind.
Oh, completely.
And we learned so much, and all of it was just so fascinating, and the pieces came together into such a beautiful little tapestry.
Yeah.
And it has completely redefined how we look at a character in a show that means so much to us.
So speaking of enthusiastic research, our next episode is going to be the first of two parts where we talk about T.S. Eliot's The Four Quartets.
Which I was recently on a trip and I read this on the plane, and I was telling Hilary I was so invested that I think I scared the man sitting next to me because I kept just like making these like, like insane sound. Like I would just be like, oh my God, like just like all these like little sound effects, and I'm just like every now and then I would have to like close the book really quickly and like just like process, and then I would open it and just scribble furiously notes, and like it's so full of like post-it notes. I'm completely changed.
My only regret is the man sitting next to you did not make a video.
I know,
put
it
on
would have been
TikTok.
so great to see. Like, this is me preparing. Because he looked over at me at one point just like there's no other way to describe his face other than, what is wrong with her?
What is she
reading? What's happening? And then like I would just catch him kind of like giving me quick little side glances every now and then, just like, again, just being like, what is going on over there? What is happening to this woman sitting next to me?
T.S. Eliot is happening.
And it's just me reading T.S. Eliot and going, oh my God, now I understand everything
about Twin Peaks. Yeah. So we just couldn't be more excited to talk about this. So that'll be our next episode. We're going to do half of the Four Quartets.
Yes.
Just because there's so much to talk about.
So many
and
post-it
we don't
notes.
want to make a we don't want to make a 4-hour episode.
Yeah.
Of course. But in the meantime, it would mean so much to us. Please, if you could, go onto whatever platform you get your podcast from and leave us a rating, hopefully a 5-star rating. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, to leave us a review.
Yeah.
That we've learned that really boosts our visibility
Yeah.
on these platforms if we get reviews and ratings. And so then that would mean other people who might enjoy this podcast will find it.
Yes. And, this could also be a great way that just to get some reviews in, if you have like an idea for a topic that you think that we should explore, leave a review being like, hey, I like this podcast. Could you do this next? And I promise we will pay attention. We are ravenous for ideas. We already have a very long list, but we are also
so excited.
ravenous.
And we have heard from some folks on Instagram
Yes.
who have reached out to us with marvelous ideas.
Oh, yeah.
which
They are
have
on the list.
Gone on the list, definitely. Speaking of Instagram, please follow us there.
Yes, Full Blossom of the Evening. Please come and find us. Especially like with any of these episodes, I also really try to post a lot of side-by-side comparison pictures, share things from the materials that we use in these episodes, like any poems that we talk about or stuff. I love to like post a graphic with that poem, anything like that, so that you can really understand what we're seeing. We want to share it with you visually as well.
We're going to just be spamming you with Marlon Brando pictures.
It's true. So get ready for that. You're welcome.
Well, thank you once again for listening to the Full Blossom of the Evening.
And we're going to sign off, of course, with "It was Laura, and she's come to kiss you goodbye."
Goodbye, listeners.
Goodbye, listeners.
Gary, I have no idea where this will lead us, but I have a definite feeling it will be a place